Echo of Regret. Part 5. The Echo of Regret. Part 5. The Fall. The Echo of Regret. Part 5. Description. 60 days into her reign, Vanessa Hitch's empire is not collapsing. It is being torn apart, piece by piece, by the very hand she built it with. In China, 100 men move like ghosts through tunnels no one told her existed. In her own command structure, 11 people she once broke and remade in her image have stopped calling themselves her instruments. The people of 5 nations have run out of fear left to give her. As the walls close in, Vanessa answers the only way she has ever known how, with fire, with steel, with total annihilation, and discovers, in her final hours, that the throne she built on her father's blood was never as steady as she believed. This is the story of how the woman who could not be found was finally, inevitably, cornered, and how, in the last seconds of her life, she became the very thing she swore she would destroy. The Echo of Regret. Part 5. The tunnels beneath the Chinese border had been there for 11 years before Vanessa Hitch ever set foot in Beijing, dug not by her people, but by smugglers who had learned, generations ago, that borders were only real for people who respected them. She had never known about them because the men who did know, her own generals, the officers she had elevated, armed, and paid too little while she funneled the lion's share of every seized fortune into accounts with her name on them, had decided, quietly and without a single vote taken, that they would keep that knowledge to themselves. It began as spite. It ended as slaughter. 100 men moved through those tunnels in the first week of the second month. Men who had watched brothers dragged into town squares and shot for the crime of flinching too slowly. Men who had watched sisters starve under a currency worth less than the paper it was printed on. Men who understood, the way people who have lost everything understand, that grief organizes faster than any government ever could. They came up out of the dark in Beijing and Moscow and along the Saudi coastline, carrying weapons bought with money that should have gone to Vanessa's own soldiers. Money her generals had begun quietly diverting the moment they realized their queen counted every yuan and ruble that passed through her hands, but never once counted the men she was spending like ammunition. Vanessa's watchdogs never saw them coming, because Vanessa's watchdogs were exhausted, underpaid, and being run in 5 directions at once by a woman who screamed over encrypted lines at 3 in the morning and called it leadership. She had built the largest private army the modern world had ever seen and had never once learned that an army isn't loyalty, it's leverage, and leverage cuts both ways. By the end of the first week, an entire platoon had vanished from her Beijing garrison. No radio contact, no bodies, no trail, because there was no trail to find. The men hadn't deserted so much as they'd been offered a choice more honest than anything Vanessa had ever given them: die anonymous in her service, or pick up a weapon and put it to better use. Most of them didn't hesitate. It happened again in Moscow. It happened in the hills outside Riyadh, where 5 installed rulers already lay dead in their own hallways, and a 6th attempt was quietly, permanently abandoned. Her intelligence, once precise enough to orchestrate a bloodless global coup in a single Christmas morning, began returning nothing but static and contradictions, because the people feeding her that intelligence had started feeding the resistance instead, and feeding her only enough truth to keep her blind a little longer. The people fighting her weren't an army. They came in cells of 20, hit a fuel convoy or a supply depot, and vanished before her forces could triangulate a position, burying their dead where no drone would ever find them and their enemies where no one would ever look for them at all. 100,000 people, speaking a dozen languages, coordinating through nothing more sophisticated than word of mouth, and a shared hatred sharp enough to survive translation. Vanessa told herself this was friction, the natural cost of conquest. She had not planned for erosion, the slow, silent kind of failure that doesn't announce itself with a single battle, but with 100 small absences that only become visible once there's nothing left standing. She answered it the only way she knew how. If the people would not kneel, she would erase the ground they stood on. She summoned Colonel Riley and gave an order with no room left in it for the man he used to believe he was. 24 hours. All 5 cities. If I can't have them, no one gets to have them. She wired him another $1 million, because money was the only language she had ever bothered to learn fluently. Riley didn't answer right away. Somewhere over water that no longer felt like it belonged to any flag, he sat with the order and let it settle into him like poison. He said yes. He didn't mean it the way she thought he did. While Riley recruited his platoon and stalled the timeline, he dressed up as operational necessity. The resistance reached her front gate faster than her thinned, underpaid security detail could hold. Thousands of them, soldiers who had defected in the tunnels, mothers who had buried children under a curfew law, sons who had watched fathers shot in a public square for the crime of not smiling fast enough. They could not breach the walls. Not yet. Captain Petrova's private guard held the line with the kind of discipline that isn't loyalty, only fear of what Vanessa did to people who failed her. But numbers have their own gravity. And Vanessa Hitch, watching the feed swell with bodies she hadn't yet killed, felt something claw up through her chest that she hadn't felt since she was 12 years old, kneeling over her mother on a bathroom floor with no one left to explain the world to her. She felt cornered. Vanessa Hitch, cornered, had never once chosen to run. She went to the weapons room and took the flamethrower down herself, felt its weight settle against her shoulder like something she'd been waiting her whole life to hold, and walked alone through the marble and gold of a house built on 2 murders she still called justice. She opened the gate with her own hands. The crowd surged, and she pulled the trigger and held it. Fire rolled across the front line in a wave that turned screaming into silence in seconds, turned people who had walked for days seeking something like justice into black, unrecognizable shapes on the dirt. She held the trigger long after any tactical purpose had been served, because this had stopped being tactics 30 seconds in. This was appetite. She felt the heat on her own face and did not step back from it. Somewhere underneath the smoke and the smell of it, the girl who had once been powerless was finally, fully, making someone else understand what powerless felt like, and she loved it. She loved it the way her father had loved the bottle, the way a starving thing loves the first thing it's ever allowed to eat. She walked back inside laughing when the tank ran dry. Behind her, Petrova's guard cut down what remained of the crowd in disciplined bursts, and hundreds more fell in minutes. Unarmed, most of them, people who had believed that numbers alone might finally outweigh her. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. She came back out with a rocket launcher and took her time, because this was no longer war. This was recreation. A grenade first, thrown almost lazily into a cluster of people trying to drag their wounded to safety. She watched the blast without flinching, the way she had once watched her father bleed out beneath her hands, and felt nothing but relief. Then she found the largest pocket of resistance, men and women sheltering behind 2 armored trucks, and sighted the launcher along its length with a steadiness Major Tanaka himself would have envied. She fired. The trucks and everyone using them as cover disappeared in a single devastating instant. 300 people, maybe more, gone in the time it took her to exhale. She laughed, a raw, delighted sound that didn't belong to the billionaire in the tailored coat or the grieving widow who had once fooled a hospital full of nurses. It belonged to something that had been growing in her since she was 12, fed every year by every choice she'd made to answer pain with more of it, bigger, louder, until pain was the only language left in her. She went back inside to call her pilot, hungry for the sound of the world ending exactly on her schedule. ETA, she demanded. 5 minutes, Riley told her. It wasn't true, and hadn't been true for longer than she knew. That should have happened 10 minutes ago. Her voice climbed into something uglier than even her own people had heard from her before. Words aimed at a man who had spent 10 years convincing himself his loyalty to her meant something, and who was, in that exact moment, deciding it never had. She told him he was worthless. She told him she'd take back every dollar she'd ever paid him and put a bullet in him herself if he cost her 1 more minute. She meant every word of it, and Riley, listening, understood with total clarity that he was talking to a woman who had never once in her life loved anything she couldn't also destroy. Roger, out, he said, and cut the line before she could hear what he said next, alone in his cockpit, to no one but himself. I don't need this. This was never my war. He thought of the year he'd spent believing her promises of a new world order. He thought of the 10 brothers and the handful of sisters under his old command who had died fighting a war that existed because one woman had decided the planet owed her a throne. He got back on the radio and told her there'd been a change of plans. 20 minutes now, not 5, and they were swapping the payload. Bombs and explosives traded for something with a different kind of finality. Something, he told her, That would guarantee she won the war outright. He didn't tell her which war he meant. Vanessa screamed with joy. She threw her head back and praised something she no longer had a name for, God or fate or her own genius. By then there was no difference left in her mind. She was still laughing when the sound of jet engines rolled in low over her estate. And for one confused second, she wondered why Riley would fly so close before a drop, before the part of her that had once studied her own father for 7 patient years, the part that understood betrayal better than anyone alive, finally understood. She had built her whole empire on being the one who saw it coming. She did not see this coming. In the half-second before the weapon found her fortress, Vanessa Hitch thought of her father, not the monster from her mother's stories, but a stranger's face she'd studied in photographs and financial filings for 7 years, a man she had built her entire second self around destroying. She thought of the meal he had cooked her the night she killed him, the desperate hope in his eyes when he believed love had finally found him after decades of being alone with his own wreckage. She felt no grief for it. Even here, even now, she felt nothing that resembled regret. Only a flash of pure, undiluted fury that the ending wasn't going to be hers to write. This wasn't supposed to happen like this, she thought, or screamed, the words swallowed by the sound of the world coming apart around her. She did not get a moment of clarity. She did not get a redemption she hadn't earned. What she got, in the last fraction of a second her mind was still capable of forming a thought, was the certainty, cold, absolute, and far too late to matter, that she had spent her whole life becoming exactly the thing she told herself she was avenging. Lawrence Hubbard had beaten a woman he claimed to love until she saw no way out but the bottom of a pill bottle. Vanessa Hitch had burned strangers alive in the street and called it a kingdom. Cruelty does not skip a generation just because the second generation dresses it up as justice. It only gets colder, more efficient, more total. She had told herself for a decade that she was nothing like him. In the end, she had simply become his masterpiece. She had never let herself wonder, not once in 10 years of careful, murderous ambition, whether Teresa's death had ever really been about being called ugly or unworthy at all. Whether something older and darker than a drunk man's cruelty had been sitting in that family long before either of them was born, patient, waiting, content to let Lawrence Hubbard take the blame for a debt that had never belonged to him alone. It didn't matter now. Whatever had been chasing that bloodline down through 2 generations of ruin had finally, completely, caught up with the last of it. She never had children. She told herself it was ambition, that the empire, not a family, was the legacy worth leaving. But the truth, buried where she never let herself look, was simpler and far uglier than that. Every man she had ever let close enough to matter, she had used, discarded, or killed, the same pattern her mother had lived and died inside of. Except Teresa had turned the violence inward and Vanessa had turned it, without hesitation, on the entire world. The blast that found Hubbard Manor, she'd never bothered to rename it. Some buried, unexamined part of her had wanted to keep it exactly as her father left it, turned the estate and everyone still standing inside it into a light bright enough to be seen from 3 counties away. It took the mansion. It took the fortune. It took the throne of 5 nations that had, for exactly 61 days, answered to a woman most of the world would never learn the name of. It took Vanessa Hitch, and buried with her every trace of mercy she had never once extended to anyone else. The 5 nations she had seized did not return cleanly to what they had been. Empires built on secrecy don't collapse quietly. They collapse into wreckage that keeps surfacing for years. Investigators in 3 countries began comparing notes on a network of officials who all, independently, began cooperating the moment the woman controlling them stopped existing. Not out of conscience, most of them, but out of the same instinct for self-preservation Vanessa herself had spent a decade teaching them. 11 people who had believed themselves architects of a new world order sat in interrogation rooms and traded what they knew for what was left of their own lives. And the picture that emerged, piece by ugly piece, was worse than any of the investigators had been prepared to believe. Not all of it surfaced. Some of it never will. Money like that doesn't simply vanish. It moves, quietly, into new hands, and somewhere those hands are still spending it. A maid named Maria Alvarez, having lost years of her life to a frame Vanessa had built with surgical patience, was eventually cleared. a legal formality that returned her name and gave her nothing else back. No one apologized to her in any way that mattered. No one ever does. Lawrence Hubbard's fortune sat unclaimed for years, tangled in a legal limbo that outlasted the headlines and the confessions. His will still drafted for a daughter who had come looking for him only once, and only to make sure he never had the chance to know why. The city Lawrence Hubbard once surveyed from his penthouse office still stands, its skyline glittering over people who have no idea how close the world came to answering, permanently, to a single unseen hand. The echo did not end because anyone learned anything from it. It ended the only way this kind of story ever ends, in fire, in silence, and in wreckage that keeps quietly claiming new casualties long after the woman who caused it has stopped being able to answer for any of it. End of Part 5. End of The Echo of Regret. About the author Michael Anthony Neal Jr. Michael Anthony Neal Jr. is a multifaceted artist and entrepreneur, a true force in the creative world. Hailing from Marina, California, and now residing in the vibrant city of Seattle, Washington, Michael is an established author who fearlessly explores all genres, captivating readers with his diverse storytelling. Beyond the written word, he is a talented musician, artist, and songwriter, crafting compelling music that resonates with audiences. Michael's entrepreneurial spirit shines through his ownership of Thrilla Productions, a dynamic production and publishing company, and Hoodies by Design, a unique clothing and accessory business. It is the profound love for what he does that fuels his relentless drive, allowing him to seamlessly juggle the demands of writing and publishing books, creating and publishing music, and running his thriving businesses. For Michael, this isn't just work. It's his passion, his dream life realized. Created using notebooks,